Okay, so again, as we've said, it's the acronym reminds us of the areas we need to cover. So we can see a similarity, both are using stand first. We can see differences, the way that they foreground and introduce their writers, their contributors, the way that one uses an interrogative and one uses a declarative. Now, the level of difference can be at a language level, at the level of representation, at the level of meaning, at the level of opinion. However, both of them are presenting an opinion that is defensive. Okay, it's defending accents, it's defending people's right to choose. Okay, so actually that gives us a variety of ways in. Now, a single paragraph doesn't have to cover all those ways. Okay, it doesn't have to cover everything. We're writing under time conditions. The exam board is more than aware that we are like limited, that when we write under time, we don't have to cover everything. So I just want to remind you before we move on that there is a rank, if you like, in the mark scheme. So evaluation ranks more highly than explanation. Linking and comparing has to be foregrounded from the start. When you begin to think about context, it does elevate your response. So there are certain things that you don't want to get them in every paragraph, but if they're in the majority of your paragraphs, you're securing a style of analysis that's hitting that higher criteria. Now, these next two bits also cover the opening. So we're still going to follow this ideal structure. We're just going to talk about the opening paragraphs, and then you're going to choose, based on our discussions, the information that you use to write your paragraphs for today. Okay, so we know that the top section is text A, and then we're looking at text B. So text A, they say you should always dress for success. But should that extend to the way you speak? So we've got this cohesive structure that text A is posing questions for their reader, for their audience. Now, questions always position the audience like you're trusting them to be intelligent, you're trusting them to be capable of thought and intelligent thought. So there's a little bit of flattery, a little bit of recognition that you can position your audience, okay, to respond, to think, to reflect. And our writer of text A has done that twice through those interrogatives. They say you should always dress for success, but should that extend to the way you speak? Now, again, we've got a but it's trumped by that. Now that upscales this to a complex interrogative. If you'd have just got as far as but and said, oh, it's a compound because that's a coordinate conjunction, your reasoning would be right, but your conclusion would be wrong. Okay, which seems so unfair, doesn't it? So always make sure you look at the whole sentence before you label it in terms of its sentence type. Okay, a few interesting things. Who is this they? Now, they and you. So we've got this polarizing of positions. Now, this is quite interesting. We looked last term at some of these ways that the audience, the readership can be positioned. And we looked at these words polarizing, universalizing, dramatization. Now, we could say that this is an example of polarization. Now, they're not separating themselves as a writer from the readership, but they are creating two distinct groups. We've got this they versus you. So there are polar groups. They say you should. Okay, so this they creates a little bit of interest. Who are they? They makes it a plural group, but they're indefinite. They're not named specifically. Now, that's interesting as the article continues, because actually one of the things sometimes about negative attitudes or bias or prejudice is the group that are biased and prejudiced often hide behind certain things. They never come out and say, hi, I'm so-and-so and I'm prejudiced. Hi, I'm so-and-so and I'm a bigot. You know, concealment is part of the guise of somebody that might have prejudiced or not or biased attitudes. So this they is recognizing that there is a group who are polarizing themselves, okay, from our writer, and she's hoping you, the reader. Okay, so the polarization of two groups, the creation of two groups, they versus you. Okay, so they say you should always dress for success, but should that extend to the way you speak? We're not adverse to dressing appropriately. Now, that lovely little note there about universalizing, polarizing. Universalizing is where you assume or position the audience that they're on the same, that they're aligned with your opinion, that they share your opinion. And we is a really small pronoun choice that suggests a universalizing approach. Okay, so as soon as I say we think this, we're doing that, we're a collective group, we're opposite, we're polarized to the they, this invisible group who are telling us what to do. Okay, and it's a we moment. Our writer Chile is aligning herself with us as readers. We're not adverse to dressing appropriately to make a good impression at work or for a social agreement, even if it, engagement, even if it means wearing clothes we wouldn't normally choose to put on. Is changing your accent to get ahead any different? So we've got something we've seen before, this lovely, the green bits I've just been pulling out for you. We've got a semantic set, extent, which introduces our extended metaphor that links to dress and how we put on clothes. So we've got you should always dress for success. We've got that clause phrase. We've got that use of the second person pronoun you. We've got the modal should always dress for success. So dress being used in the present tense. Okay. We've got we're, so a change here. We've got a pronoun shift here. We're not adverse to dressing appropriately, but we've got the verb dressing here to extend that metaphor. Now, adverse is an interesting word choice. We're not adverse to dressing appropriately. Adverse means to be against something. So your level of labeling at this stage, this is where you make your distinctions, A's, B's, C's. Okay, and I'm just going to challenge some of you to look at the labeling you might apply. You could just apply the writer creates a semantic set to introduce an extended metaphor linked to dress. Okay, but if you can unpack those moments, if you can unpack the clause structure, if you can talk about the use of the noun clothes, the repetition of the verb dress, that strengthens your labeling. Okay, that just strengthens your evidence that you can describe how language works. Okay, then we've got this final interrogative, so this repeated structure of 3 questions at least, one in the stand first, one in that first sentence, and again in this opening section. Is changing your accent to get ahead any different? Now you could argue she's saying the same thing in 3 different ways. Now that doesn't mean she's repetitive, that means she's emphatic. She's emphatically stressing this question. She really wants us thinking about this, okay? Now, here's a huge difference, okay? We've got the semantic set extended to the metaphor of dress really being emphasized in the opening of text A. Text B does something differently, okay? Text B does the extended set of lexical choices that establishes the anecdotal perspective. Now, we've talked about this when we analysed this before, so I'm not giving anything away. This should be in our notes. So again, you could go for your overview, extended lexical choices to establish anecdotal perspective, which is brilliant. It's still descriptive. It's still explaining the writer's choice. We're talking about a point of difference, a comparative difference. So we're hitting all the criteria. However, you could talk about context here, appreciating in context. So even though Dr. Katie Edwards is writing for a newspaper, she primarily is actually not a journalist. So a contextual difference here is that newspapers invite people of repute, people of particular reputations or opinions to write for newspapers. We don't get it till the end of the first article, but Chilu is a contributor to digital communication. So somebody that might be asked to, that's their job as a journalist, as a contributor. She works journalistically. That's her primary function, her primary purpose. Whereas Dr. Katie Edwards is maybe being invited or approached by this newspaper to share her findings. So we see that immediate difference that can be linked to context. Yet they're both in newspapers, they're both examples of journalism and opinion writing. However, Chilu is presented as a writer, whereas we get to work out that Dr. Katie Edwards isn't. She's primarily a professor, she's primarily an academic, but she's been invited to make her contribution to this newspaper. Okay, so you could, though, go into that level of labeling. You could talk about the adverbial last month, the use of the pronoun I. You could talk about the lexical set that establishes the professional credentials of Katie Edwards, academic conference, colleague, professional introduction, doctoral student from a UK Russell Group University. Okay, and then actually the real crux of this anecdotal story, that Katie Edwards was insulted by this student, that this student bypassed professional pleasantries and went straight in with a moment of ridicule and mockery. So you could talk about that lovely cohesive link back to the headline. So we've got lots of potential things that we can do. Now, in order to help us decide how we're going to structure our paragraphs today, you're going to get a choice in a minute. You can go freestyle. Okay, now what I mean by freestyle, so I'm just going to go back this way. You can take your notes made and just turn them into paragraphs using your own sentence structures, your own ideas. But I would challenge you to write a paragraph on text A with a comparative link and a paragraph to text B. Now, if you prefer the structure, here's our A grade student again, and this is how their essay continued. Now, remember, our A grade student is writing about a totally different topic. Okay, so their quotes and things and their labeling don't translate to what we're doing. However, we can use their model. So text A uses lexis from the semantic field of infectious disease, such as pandemic, chronic virus, when quoting the actor Lake Bell. She represents her views following Aitchison's descriptive of the prescriptivist view of cultural influences infecting English. Okay, so what have we got within there? We've got the D of descriptive labeling, semantic field. We've got an identification, okay, of views. She represents her views. Now, actually, this isn't perfect. They haven't unpacked what that view is, whether it's positive or negative yet. We've got an explanation following the description of prescriptivist views. We've got quotes. So it's doing our idea structure, okay, but in I would argue at this stage quite a superficial level, and this is still an A grade student. Text B attempts to root itself in a feminist perspective, then negates the idea of freedom and expression by dictating how women should speak. So actually that's a really intelligent moment of identification that the student's done. So although it's not perfect, when they get it right, they get it really right. Okay? So that's that identification, a strong sentence identifying the perspective of the writer. Text B uses the opening patriarchy as inventive to position an audience as being to blame, but to not being to blame, but being a victim of the system. I imagine this to be more effective. So there's your effective interpretation than the Daily Mail positioning. It is the fault of women. Later in text A, the actor Lake Bell attempts to seem as if she's slating this woman because she cares. Okay, so then he goes on to introduce more quotes after describing them as unsavory sounds. She uses an active voice, there's our description, to describe the subject women. And something, the verb, yeah, so you can actually see writing can be different, and choosing the verb to themselves, ignoring the context of a male-dominated societies. Alternatively, so there's our comparative link. Text B describes women's sociolects as being hobbled by the intonation. This suggests a larger forces at play than women's tonality, hurting their careers. This again is more effective, so there's your consistent evaluation to an intended audience. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do, if you don't want to write your own paragraphs, is when we pause now, you're going to write your next section where you take the notes, the ideas we've got, and write about text A and text B, okay, in terms of how their openings present their views. You can use the phrases that I've picked out here to help you. So if we were looking back at our notes, love this, okay, so we could say text A uses an opening complex sentence in order to. Text A, they present their views following. Text B attempts to. Text B uses the opening. So you can use my phrases. Okay, you can look at the A grade paragraph again and see if you can follow the structure. Or you can write your own ideal paragraph answering the questions. How, based on these openings, do we know that Julie or Katie Edwards is thinking and feeling a particular way about accents? Okay, so I hope that gives you time to do that. It doesn't have to be really long. Put your timer on. Give yourselves 10 minutes. 10 minutes writing time for 2 paragraphs is the reality of the exam. Okay, and see what you can do. Wednesday, we're going to come back and finish and just kind of bring the next sections together. And then you're going to be given a lesson this week just to complete that essay. All right, my lovelies, I hope that makes sense. Remember, pause, take as much time, reread these paragraphs, use that sentence structure, and I'll see you on the other side.